Okay, so our first speaker, Dr. T, is a sought-after lecturer and expert in skin health and longevity, and the connection between objective, measurable skin parameters and whole-body anti-aging, skin lesions treatment and prevention, clinical nutrition, functional medicine, and laboratory tests. He is introducing non-invasive precision instruments for clinical diagnosis of skin aging with powerful treatment protocols available to all types of practitioners. Dr. T is President Emeritus and Professor of Medical Sciences, Clinical Nutrition, and Functional Medicine at the University of Natural Medicine in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and San Dimas. And his presentation is Goodbye Colorectal Cancer and Inflamed Gut, Eliminate the Risk of Intestinal Disease and Colonoscopy. So please welcome Dr. T.
So anyway, if you know how to blow the air, if you are upwind from Fukushima, just blow really hard the opposite direction. And I'm really happy that we have all these people who already decided to vote for Donald Trump, therefore they don't need to listen to his lecture today, or his speech tonight is not so important for you. You already are committed to voting for him, like most Californians. Some people are taking me seriously. I'm going to have a big political backlash from this one. Okay, so today we are bringing good news to Silicon Valley. News that the most scary cancer, the lethal silent killer that kills both women and men alike, a condition that even in modern countries that have all the most advanced therapies for colorectal cancer are only saving 40% of the people who are diagnosed within 4 or 5 years of diagnosis, which means that the other 60% are suffering from horrible, debilitating surgeries, having to walk around with partial colon, if that, or colostomy bags, or numerous other issues with the results of radiation and surgery and chemo, and still 40% die from this cancer. 40% die. 60% suffer from all those side effects of the treatments that are necessary to keep them alive, and they survive, but the quality of life is dramatically diminished. This situation can change dramatically, and we can actually say goodbye to colorectal cancer, and I have the numbers to prove it. Over the last 13 or 14 years, I've been utilizing a laboratory test called the M2PK test, which has not been brought to the US yet. That's why Americans have never heard about it. Doctors have not heard about it. Even holistic doctors never heard about it because it simply was not available in the United States. And I had to actually ship stool specimens to Germany to get the test done. I started doing it close to 14 years ago. And initially, I didn't know what to do with the results. When they came positive for cancer, I was thinking, okay, now what? Am I supposed to send them to doing a colonoscopy? Which is what normally you would think is the next logical step. But then I started doing a lot of reading about colonoscopy itself and read some research coming from the gastroenterology journals, and also heard from MD researchers who specifically study things like that all the time and what are the effects of various diagnostic tools. Especially, are those diagnostic tools necessary for screening of large populations, like we're doing today with colonoscopy? And we have to ask a lot of strong questions. I'm not saying that all colonoscopies are bad. Some of them are necessary in specific situations. But when we use colonoscopy as a screening tool for the large population, when we tell healthy people to just go through this procedure, are we aware fully of the benefits and the risks? And would we actually go through this procedure if we knew the full risk of doing it? And wouldn't we then ask our holistic doctors, who are still, some of them, as a knee-jerk reflex, will send you to a colonoscopy whenever there is a suspicion of anything. And I would say, why would holistic doctors who are trying to break away from that mold, why are they still recommending procedures that the science is not yet established with regards to their benefit versus risk? When you look at the reviews, the Cochrane reviews and other meta-analysis of multiple scientific studies, we see conclusively that colonoscopy has never been proven to reduce the mortality and morbidity of colorectal cancer in the population. Yet as a society, we're spending many, many billions of dollars on a test that has never been proven to reduce the disease for which it is intended. What we see instead is that a far greater number of people are actually suffering detrimental effects, adverse reactions to the procedure than the number of people who actually are diagnosed with colorectal cancer. If about 55,000 are diagnosed every year as suffering from the condition, over 70,000 are suffering from the horrific effect, adverse effect of the actual procedure called colonoscopy. So in some cases, it's worth it. When I have a patient who is bleeding profusely, and when I look into the anus, I see a large tumor, and I don't know how big it is, and it's bleeding every day, then I might consider the possibility of colonoscopy if you can even push the tube in there, if there's enough room. But for a general population, anybody who hits 50, I don't know if I want to put them through the risk, because some of the side effects are death, lacerations. Sometimes people have heart attacks because of the activities of the laxatives that they take before the procedure. Infections, contaminations. They often cannot efficiently clean or autoclave the equipment between patients. So the same long pipe that went into one person will find its way into the next person with some cross-contamination. You know, it's not necessarily the person you want to share bodily fluids with. And there are various other risk factors that are associated with this procedure. In addition, the procedure is often unable to detect cancer even if it's present. First, the cancer has to be big enough to be visualized on a camera. Second, the cancer has to be in one spot, because if it's very thinly spread throughout the colon, you will not be able to visualize it. Third, it has to be clear of any fecal matter that might cover it, and then you won't see anything. Fourth, it has to be a part of something that protrudes into the space of the colon called the lumen. It has to protrude for the camera to see it clearly, because the camera looks straight ahead. And you see things that are protruding into the pipe. Many of the lethal tumors of the colorectal mucosa are in the flat portion that are far more virulent and lethal and rapidly growing than the ones that are found within polyps. And those are not visible. The most important lesions that can become the lethal cancers are not visualized until it's really too late. Colonoscopy will not be efficient in catching them. It's efficient in finding polyps. And polyps become suddenly the pretext to doing colonoscopy instead of colorectal cancer, because the vast majority of colorectal cancers are very slow growing. They can take 15 years, according to the scientific literature. 10 years to 15 to 20 years. If they take that long, Is it going to necessarily show itself when you do a colonoscopy or much, much later? Therefore, most people who come back again and again every 5 years to do a colonoscopy, they don't enjoy the procedure very well. It's a very low compliance procedure. Most people don't like to do colonoscopy for obvious reasons. It's highly invasive and uncomfortable and embarrassing to some people, perhaps enjoyable to a few others. But the vast majority of people are not going to like that procedure. And that's why the compliance is fairly low. Even in the United States, where people are very compliant and docile and following what the doctor's orders are. By comparison to Europeans, who really don't like this procedure, and they've done a study. They've given free colonoscopy to the European population in specific areas, and they found out that less than 2% of the people, even though it was given to them for free, and they were told that it would save them from the horrible consequences of colorectal cancer, close to 2% were the only people who were actually allowing this to happen. More than 98%, I think it was 98.3%, who refused to have colonoscopy. That's very low compliance in Europe. In America, it's probably much higher compliance, maybe closer to 50%. I'm not 100% sure, because Americans are not like Europeans. You know, Europeans will do their own way. They will fight. They will keep smoking in bars until late. You know, they will not allow people to tell them what to do. They will even keep wearing Speedos. So Europeans are independent thinkers, and they are the ones that really need an alternative to colonoscopy because they don't want to do it. But Americans need an alternative too. A, because colonoscopy is risky. B, highly invasive. C, uncomfortable. Most people will not want to do it enough times to give it any meaning clinically. And the expense. Society is really paying so much. So we do need an alternative. And there is an alternative which came from Europe because that's where they needed it most. That alternative comes from the test called M2PK. And I want to share with you a few scientific studies that were done, although by now we have a few dozens of scientific studies that confirm that colonoscopy is not a good screening tool for the reasons I mentioned, and that M2PK is the best screening test for the entire population. A screening test for healthy people who don't have symptoms yet but want to know if something is brewing, if it's starting the process. You can catch it much, much earlier because you're not looking for advancing large tumors. And this test is not at all like a blood test in the stool. A blood test in the stool is extremely inaccurate because numerous types of lesion could lead to blood in the poop. It could be blood from ulcers. It could be laceration, hemorrhoids, fissures. It could be severe inflammatory disorders of the digestive system, all of which would lead to some bleeding, and that's why you cannot rely on occult blood in the stool as a good test for colorectal cancer. It's not specific at all. Whereas M2PK has been shown in more recent studies than this one to be a test of at least 95% specificity. And the larger the population you study, especially if the population is of people who do not have symptoms, who are not previously diagnosed, people who have probably good health, relatively speaking, the specificity goes up, closer to 100%. Especially if you repeat the test every year or 2 years, you actually know for a fact if you have colorectal cancer without doing a colonoscopy, which means that all of those problems we discussed earlier don't exist anymore. And more importantly, because this is a stool test, and the stool comes in touch with the digestive system where the cancer might be growing, this is the reason why it's very difficult not to find it in your poop. Your poop is, to a large extent, your own cells that have sloughed off from the gut. Almost 50% of the stool by weight is your own cells that came out of the digestive system. So those cells, if they have a parameter that can indicate the presence of cancer, it will be a very accurate test because it will be in the stool. And it will be a quantitative test as well. It will not just say yes or no, you have cancer. It will also be appropriate to the gradation of the cancer, the staging of it. The higher the number, the more advanced the cancer. And that's been also my clinical experience in the last 14 years in seeing how the response to treatment correlated with the number, the amount of M2PK enzymes that were found in the stool. So what is the M2PK? That's M2 pyruvate kinase. Pyruvate kinase is an important enzyme that is proliferating in cells that are under anaerobic conditions. They don't have enough oxygen, they have to create energy. Without oxygen, they need more pyruvate kinase, which is the end result of glycolysis. It's an anaerobic form of energy production. That's typical for cancer cells. When you have a cancer cell in the mucosal lining of the gut, they will manufacture a specific type of pyruvate kinase, and that's called M2 pyruvate kinase. That type is only found in those cancerous cells and not in other cells. That is why when the number goes up above a certain arbitrary unit that was determined based on statistics over thousands of patients, it was determined that 4 units is the cutoff place. Above 4, you have colorectal cancer. Below 4, you don't have it. But if the numbers are 4.1 or 4.2, it's still very low. You have the presence of cancer at least 80% chance. But if you go to 5 or 6 or 7, the numbers go up dramatically. If you have 9 or 10, now the cancer is fairly well established, even though it's still not considered very high. When you go to 15 or 20, it's going to be more difficult to take care of your cancer. And if you go to 90 or 100, and I've seen some of those, it takes a lot more to reverse the process. The good news is, so far, everybody who has tested positive for M2PK, with no exception, and followed the protocols that I have given that person, has reversed their M2PK at 100% success rate so far. I'm talking about hundreds of positive tests. 99% were negative within 3 months, which means in only 3 months they reversed their colorectal cancer. And remember, this is catching the cancer in a very early phase. Those who had higher numbers would take 6 months or even 9 months. The longest amount of time was 9 months to bring it to a 100% success rate. I assume that if we had people who come in after a colonoscopy with a huge bleeding tumor, might be a different story than those who do the M2PK and catch it early. Maybe with them the statistical result would be maybe less stellar. Maybe we will not be as successful with those people. But the trick is to catch this cancer early, and everybody agrees, holistic, allopathic, medical, naturopathic, doesn't matter. Everybody agrees that we want to catch the cancer as early as possible. Because regardless of your modalities of treatment, your results will be a lot better if you catch it early. Even if you decide to do a surgery, you will survive almost 100% of the time if you catch the cancer really early. So it's a good thing to do a test that would show it early, even if it is so early that it will not show anything on a colonoscopy. And I've tried that as well. I sent people to do colonoscopy a couple of times after they had really high levels of M2PK. In each and every one of those cases, they could still not diagnose it on the colonoscopy. It was not visible yet. It was too small for them to see it. And in fact, the Journal of Gastroenterology, this one, in 2012, showed that, in fact, there is a miss rate of 22% for polyps. Even on the same patient, if they get tested twice with colonoscopy, on one of them they will miss 22% on average the polyps that somebody else, that the same person is having with another colonoscopy on the same day.
Oh, wow.
So the colonoscopy has a very high false negative rate, meaning it's negative as if everything is okay when it is not okay. And they're still focusing especially on polyps instead of on cancer. Most polyps are not cancerous. Like we said earlier, they take many years to form cancer within them, 15 years, 20 years. So why should you do a colonoscopy when you're 75 or 80, knowing how long it would take? And why should you do it at age 50? There's really no reason to do it as a screening test. But if it's a test that just makes you go to your own bathroom and poop, which you do anyway, most of you, then you have no reason not to do it. It's a very simple procedure, no side effects. The only effect is that you have to touch a piece of paper that touches your poop. That's a horrible trauma for some people. You have to get over it. So this test, according to each and every one of those journals, and now we have numerous additional studies that confirm it and continuously increase the specificity and sensitivity, meaning there are almost no false positives. If it comes as cancer, it is cancer, it's not something else. And very sensitive test. Everybody agrees, if you look at the conclusions of each one of those studies that I showed you, they all say that it is recommended as the best screening tool for colorectal cancer. Yet, it has not been approved by the FDA. And it has been mainstream in Europe for over 20 years. Mainstream. Now, in Europe, it was given to the population for one specific purpose: to convince those pedo wearers to do colonoscopy. Because if they have a positive M2PK, then they are scared enough to be more compliant and do the colonoscopy. It was not designed to come up with a therapeutic trial to try and reverse this condition. Now, that's why I didn't know what to do at first, because I didn't have any papers, any research, anything to fall back on. So I very quietly started treating people for a short time, thinking to myself, well, if we only try for 3 months, it's not going to harm them because it's a very slow cancer. And after 3 months, we can redo the M2PK test and find out. If we did well, great. If not, colonoscopy is always an option. And today we have other options. We have virtual colonoscopy, which is even more accurate than colonoscopy in finding out whether or not you have a tumor. Sometimes the tumor could be impinging from the outside of the tube, and it won't be visible on the colonoscopy. It would be more likely to be visible on virtual colonoscopy. Sigmoidoscopy is a good option because the vast majority of tumors that are detected by colonoscopy are also in the sigmoid area. So why go the whole way when we know that depending on the hour of the day and how tired the practitioner is, they often are missing the ascending colon, the part of the colon that's furthest away from the anus. That's why if you want to do a screening test that is invasive to some extent, a sigmoidoscopy is going to be far, far superior. And there are other options. One of them I'll mention later. If you want to find out if you have colorectal cancer, you can use other options. You don't have to do a colonoscopy. But the doctors who own a colonoscopy machine are vested in recommending that specific test. It costs quite a few $1,000s to do that test. Insurance covers it at a rate of anywhere from $5,000 in some areas to $20,000 in other areas. And there's also the added cost of anesthesiology and preparation and admission, other incidental costs that add up in a hurry. And it is the single biggest diagnostic moneymaker to the medical industrial complex today. So again, I'm not saying that it's bad in every situation. In some cases, it's a necessary tool. We need to have colonoscopies for certain situations. But for some bizarre reason, it became in America the standard diagnostic tool for screening everybody. And that was irresponsible and too detrimental for society as a whole. We are already crumbling at the medical care cost in this country more than any other country in the world, and colonoscopy is one of the main causes for that. So I tried that approach because even before I started doing the M2PK, I did a stool panel that was not the same as it is today, but it was a panel that showed me quite a lot of things about the health of the gastrointestinal mucosa. How inflamed it is, how balanced it is microbiologically, how the digestive residues indicate that you are able or unable to digest and absorb your food and your nutrients, and some of the other parameters of digestion like pancreatic enzymes, like acidity, like bile secretion, bile acid or bile salts, all of which are important to the process of inflammation. And by doing those tests, I knew more or less how to treat people just for health, just to get their gut going, just to eliminate or reduce the inflammatory process. I'll get to some examples a little bit later. And in the meantime, I just wanted to see what the M2PK test looks like. In this case, it shows this person has a 10.6 unit, and that means that there is colorectal cancer. And that patient became negative after just 3 months. It's fairly easy to reverse it completely within 3 months, as long as the numbers are not much higher than 10, from my experience. And the other test, the panel that I call the FDH panel, Functional and Digestive Health Panel, but originally I named it after my foundation, the Functional and Dental Health Foundation. That's why it was called the FDH panel. But for people who want things to be more generic, I change it to Functional Digestive Health Panel. It's still the same FDH. And as you can tell, it looks for about 30 parameters of digestive health. When those parameters are out of balance, when you have too much of a certain compound or not enough of another, too much of some microbes or not enough of others, you end up in a state of imbalance that could lead to inflammation. Why is inflammation so important? Because already years ago, science has realized that people who have chronic inflammation are the same people who have high risk of cancer. Any part of your body that has chronic inflammation within it is going to potentially develop into cancer. Why is that? Because inflammation, by definition, forces numerous components of your defense mechanisms to reverse and go backwards in differentiation, to de-differentiate. You go back into stem cell formation. Because you need to proliferate for healing, for repair, for immune activation, that proliferation requires making new cells, and we need some stem cells to support this process to make new cells. That's why whenever we have inflammation, it is associated with proliferation, which by itself increases the risk of mutation and cancer formation, or having stem cells, if those stem cells are exposed to various factors that are themselves pro-inflammatory, toxins, for example, electromagnetic exposure, radiation or radioactive substances, any of which could affect stem cells in a way that would promote the formation of cancer. That's why chronic inflammation is not a good thing. And most of us in America are walking chronically inflamed and often unaware of it because we are so used to it. If you wake up in the morning slightly more stiff than you were in the evening before, you are inflamed. Raise your hand if you feel slightly stiff in the morning. Yes, very common. That's because your body is gradually building up the fluid in your tissues, in your joints, as a result of the leakiness associated with inflammation. And then it takes time to move and pump the fluid out of the joints and get yourself a little more mobile. That's chronic inflammation. But if you have any kind of aches and pains that are chronic and in one specific area, or if you have regular dysfunction in your digestive system, you have inflammation. What's the first symptom of gastrointestinal inflammation? The first symptom of gastrointestinal inflammation, no? No. It's a trick question. The answer is the absence of symptoms. You can have inflammation in the gut and feel nothing. Why is that? Because our nervous system is trying to be efficient. You don't have room for a brain the size of a truck. You only want the brain to get necessary information. You don't want to overload it. Therefore, in area of your body when there is no expectation of symptoms, there aren't sufficient receptors from the nervous system to bring that information to the brain. When was the last time that an ant or a spider crawled up your butt? Doesn't happen very often, does it? You have a nice sphincter there and prevents that. Even at night when you sleep, a spider is more likely to enter your mouth or your ear or your nose, but not your rectum.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. So since you don't have to feel something crawling in there, you don't have to feel a mosquito that's standing inside and about to bite it, right? Mosquitoes don't bite you in the rectum. Because of that, we don't need to have that plethora of receptors that would give that unnecessary information to the brain. It's simply not designed to happen. So mild inflammation in the colon is not going to be detected by your brain. You're not supposed to get that information, and in nature it wouldn't have happened. We'll see why in a minute. In nature you wouldn't be inflamed. If you are truly in a natural environment, like you will be when you come foraging with me, you will not be inflamed in your gut. Therefore, there would be no need to think about this entire discussion. Having reached a point where almost everybody is inflamed, first of all, we have no symptoms, but then the first symptoms begin when we start having more significant inflammation. What will be the first symptom? Perhaps like bloating, a little bit of gas, a little bit of irritation, what people call indigestion. Some people would have a lot of pain with the bloating, specifically after the meal. And other symptoms of the digestive tract, I'm sure that most people here have that. Whether it's slight diarrhea or constipation, or it doesn't matter what it is, most people today do not have 100% perfect digestive system, which means that the inflammatory process has become more advanced. We'll get to that. We'll get to all the other symptoms of the world. But right now we're talking about the digestive system and things that are specific that people will know that's associated with my gut. Right? After I eat, I feel bloated. That's my gut. People will not necessarily associate other symptoms, even though they could possibly be related, of course. So most of us have those symptoms, which means we have a more advanced inflammatory process in the gut. Because if it's mild, we probably wouldn't know about it. And many of us already start having bleeding once in a while, have hemorrhoids, and other symptoms that are more severe. That's an indicator of more significant inflammation. No wonder we have a high risk of colorectal cancer today more than ever. And in fact, after the validity of M2PK has been established, they did a study in Europe, which is one of the studies I just went through, and they tested what is the actual percentage of the population that has colorectal cancer based on the M2PK. And they found out that about 10% of people from the street have colorectal cancer. 10%. That's a huge amount. By comparison to only 55,000 that are diagnosed every year in the United States through colonoscopy. If you compare 10% with 55,000, we have 330 million Americans. In last time I read the number, before the recent immigration, that is probably going to stop very soon. If you Californian do your work, we're going to see that about 33 million Americans are walking around with colorectal cancer. And out of those, only 55,000 get diagnosed every year. So that's tiny, tiny percentage. And if you know what you're doing and you select the test based on the patient, meaning you don't just select random population, but take individuals that already have some symptoms of the digestive system or are old enough to increase their own risk, then you would have 1 out of 3 or 4. Right now I have a ratio of 1 to 3.5. So out of every 3.5 people that I test, 1 has positive M2PK. That's very high. But I don't want to test that by itself. Because if I only get the M2PK, I will not know how to treat you. I don't want to just guess. I want to know the actual level of intestinal inflammation, because all the scientific studies show conclusively that intestinal inflammation leads to colorectal cancer. So you have to treat that. And we know that studies of people with ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease conclusively have significant increase in the risk of colorectal cancer. But what about people with mild chronic inflammation? Not enough studies, but there are studies proving the connection between inflammation, regardless of intensity of it, and the development of colorectal cancer for the reasons I mentioned before. What about cutting out the polyps during colonoscopy? Is that necessarily a good thing? It increases the inflammation. You're cutting a polyp, which is already a place where tissues has proliferated and grown. So it's an area of higher risk just because it has grown. It has more cells. So there's a risk of mutation. But most polyps are benign. Polyps are not a reason for surgery. But some gastroenterologists that I know, because their patients came to me, have recommended colonic resection, cutting a chunk of your colon just because they saw 2 polyps within a few inches of each other. Absolutely unnecessary surgery that is so debilitating, and the patients go ahead with those recommendations. They think, this is my expert. And they cut their colon when most polyps are totally benign, just like most moles on your face are totally benign. Especially the ones that are grown, that are big, that protrude on your face, that are flesh color, that have been there for so many years, and only your grandchildren want you to get rid of them. And we get rid of them so easily without a scar, just for cosmetics. And they may have some sources of neurological imbalance, because obviously you have an unevenness, asymmetry between the right side and the left side. So there are other potential reasons for balancing to remove them, but not for cancer. The vast majority of them will never become cancerous. And the same is true for polyps. However, if you have inflammation in the gut that is chronic, why shouldn't the polyp also be at risk for cancer? It could be at the polyp, it could be at the flat areas, but the polyp will be slightly at increased risk because there are more cells per unit of area. And it already indicates that there was growth. And the growth means statistically there's a higher risk. But once the polyp has been formed, that polyp is not necessarily going to convert into cancer, definitely not in the next 15 years, and definitely not if you reverse the inflammatory process. Eliminate the inflammation, and the polyp will have no reason to become a cancer. No reason to remove the colon because of something like that. It's like, let me peel off your entire skin so you'll never have a mole again. Similar logic. So when you cut into a polyp, just like when you cut into a skin cancer, if there's already cancer there, you're increasing the risk of spreading it because you're introducing cancerous cells into the circulation. This is not just a theory. It's a reality that I have seen several times in practice, where patients who have done a biopsy for squamous cell carcinoma ended up dying 3 to 5 years later from metastasis of squamous cell carcinoma confirmed by biopsy, the same cancer that has spread into their liver, lungs, or bones, and they died because of the biopsy of a skin cancer. Why should it be any different with the polyps? There is a potential risk, but let's assume that the polyp is not cancerous. In most cases, it isn't. We're still cutting into it and temporarily, dramatically increasing the inflammation in that specific area because cutting leads to an inflammatory response. It's a trauma. And indeed, that's one study of its type that I've seen, shows that about 3 times as colorectal cancer has formed in people who have undergone polypectomy or cutting of the polyps as the normal population. It was spun a little bit in terms of incidents to justify doing more colonoscopies and more polypectomies. But it should be looked at from a different perspective. Is that another risk? Another procedure that we don't need? But if people went through colonoscopy after colonoscopy and found nothing, would they go back for a third or a fourth? Probably not. Polyps become the reason why people go back for another colonoscopy. Because now we have something that is fairly common. A polyp is common, and it's easy to catch. So now it becomes the red herring, the pretext to doing the colonoscopy, pretending like it is the source of cancer, when in fact, many times it is not. Be very cautious. And if you do a colonoscopy, try not to do a polypectomy because there's another alternative. If you find a polyp, even before you heard this lecture, or if you know that there are symptoms and you're worried, or even if the M2PK is positive and you don't want to do my protocols, you have every right not to do anything, to just live with it and wait and see. And do the test once in a while and see if it keeps going higher, like it would, probably, if it keeps growing. You don't have to do anything. But at least if you want to confirm the size of the cancerous tumor, you can do another test called the oncoblood test, which will tell you about 26 types of cancer based on tissue of origin. Whether or not you have, it's a yes or no. It's not a quantitative, just a qualitative yes or no type of a test. And it only detects cancer when you have at least 2 million cells of that specific cancer, whether it is in one nodule or spread around. 2 million cells is 1.2 millimeter in diameter. So it's barely visible, and most tests will miss it. But this blood test, the oncoblood test, will actually catch it. So that is another way to confirm rather than doing a biopsy. So if you decide to undergo the colonoscopy for whatever reason, at least you can indicate to the physician that you don't want to have polypectomy at all, that you'd rather do a blood test to see if it is cancerous rather than doing a biopsy and taking a risk. So this is not showing what is next. Okay. There was something else there, but I don't know what it was. So we need to ask ourselves what actually creates that inflammatory response that we're talking about that can lead to the process of cancer and a positive M2PK, and what can we do about it to reduce the overall level of inflammation in the gut as well as in the rest of the body. And many symptoms are associated with gluten, and many people are not aware that they're gluten sensitive. The mechanisms are numerous for sensitivity to gluten or to other wheat products. And that's why even people who are not normally diagnosed are suffering. From my experience, it's about 50% of the population in America that suffers from gluten sensitivity. And that's why it's an easy bet, an easy guess to try for a month or 2 months and see if there are any improvements in overall symptoms. For many people, it does a great service just to eliminate gluten. And one of the reasons that most people don't get diagnosed is that they do a blood test. The blood test does not really contain or does not have a chance to see all the antibodies that are actually formed in the gut, because not all of those antibodies will cross into the blood. Only a small percentage of them will. That's why only about 10% of people with gluten sensitivity would actually get diagnosed through a blood test. And that's the typical standard today, to just test the blood. I prefer that for gluten sensitivity, we test the stool. Then we can get better information. But doing a stool test is not always going to be enough if we're only going to have a few foods that we can test. We need to know more than just about a few foods. And we already touched before in the discussion about the complexity of our new environment that is man-made, and all the chemicals and toxins that are not just in the environment but are actually in your food and can actually create a false positive reaction associated with that food, but it's not the food itself. Maybe every time you eat soy, you're also reacting to the Roundup that comes with it. Then you will blame the soy when the result of the reaction has nothing to do with soy. For example, soy by itself is highly antigenic. It's highly complex protein. Most people are exposed to it day after day after day. Therefore, the likelihood of developing a sensitivity increases dramatically, and that's why many vegetarians and vegans who rely on soy heavily and are exposed to it almost daily with namashoyu and sauces, fermented things that have soy in them is so common. Almost everything you eat suddenly tastes Chinese. And the result is that you develop sensitivity to soy. But many foods contain the chemicals of agriculture, of storage, of growth of molds and other microbes on top of the food. And those could cause their own reaction. And that's why you need to standardize the assay, the type of substrate or the types of food that you are actually testing in a lab to know what you're truly sensitive to. Also, what you do to the food, how you cook it or not cook it, will affect the molecular structure. So some people could be sensitive to a certain food when it's cooked, but not when it's raw, and vice versa. Because sometimes the cooking denatures the protein and making it less antigenic. When I say antigenic, I mean more likely to create a reaction by which you manufacture antibodies against that substance. So if we want to have a perfect test, we would want it to contain hundreds of substances that have been purified in a legitimate, standardized fashion so that you can separate the toxins from the food. So you're testing for the legitimate foods themselves versus the chemicals and toxins, and also to test them in a cooked versus a raw state. Otherwise, you don't know. So many people can handle garlic when it's cooked, but they can't handle it when it's raw. Why not test for that? And the stool test that is available today cannot do this. But it's excellent to find out if you have severe inflammatory tendencies from gluten, from yeast, which is a major cause for Crohn's disease. Anybody with Crohn's or with the initial symptoms of inflammatory bowel, especially in childhood, often go through 10 years of suffering before they finally get diagnosed as having Crohn's disease, when all that could have been prevented if they just had this test, anti-Saccharomyces cerevisiae antibody test, which specifically looks for the antigens in the yeast, the typical yeast, which is in beer and in bread, in anything that is added. And about 10%, 5 to 10% of the people that I test have a positive reaction to yeast. The other people, 90, 95%, can handle yeast with no problem. But too many people are hearing this information and starting to avoid yeast instead of testing. And that's also a mistake. Because if you avoid yeast, you are more likely to do what? To eat fermented foods, like sourdough bread. And you think that this will be much better for you. Well, as you shall see very shortly, it's not necessarily the case. Because the ultimate measurement of truth is what nature tells us. In nature, you wouldn't be doing so many things to your food as we're doing today. And therefore, we have created sort of a monster with so many new types of reactions with our immune system, so many types of antibodies that are formed, antibody complexes that are made in the body, and many types of other immune cells, T cells, B cells, plasma cells, and complement that are interacting together in complex ways that are forming an inflammatory response in the human body that can be stopped or reduced dramatically when we do the appropriate test. So inflammation in our society is so common because we don't eat like our ancestors. And we don't live in the same environment as our ancestors. Food is only one component of that. Electromagnetic exposure is another. When I lecture about electromagnetic exposure, I remind people of a study that was done by Dr. Art Hughes, a PhD in electrical engineering, who wrote a nice dissertation before he mysteriously died. In his findings, animals that were perfectly healthy and were put in harm's way with regards to electromagnetic exposure died within 8 hours, large animals. Within 8 hours, and the finding on autopsy was that they had complete leathering of the entire gastrointestinal tube. And I imagine this happening to a smaller extent with people who can move around and escape bad areas. They will still have chronic inflammation. It just might not kill them. So there are many things besides food, but what food is to our gut is what air is to our lungs. It's the number one source of molecules that enter our body, and therefore it's very important with regard to inflammation or damage to the gut. And what our ancestors ate are food that you find in nature. When you come foraging with me, you'll see for yourself. And we'll cover that in greater depth than we do here. And you'll eat some of those things. Of course, you're not required to eat the insects. That's optional in our foraging trips. But if you choose to eat insects, I would not judge you for it, even if it's inhumane. Because insects are inevitably a part of our diet when we don't pay close attention to everything that is hiding in every little flower or floret. And that was a part of our diet. Occasionally we ate tiny bit of fish and egg and flesh that we would catch, but it would be fairly rare when we compare it with hunter-gatherers today. that are rarely capable of actually catching anything. And most of the time they have to rely on what the children and the women are picking while they're trying to get lucky out in the hunting field. So the vast majority are things like seaweeds and land-based and shore-based plants, succulent plants, flowers, some fruit and seeds, and then the roots, the bulbs, the rhizomes, the stems, the pith, and occasionally they would get lucky with something a little more substantial. That's why they would also eat most of the day. There were no 3 square meals. They were barely triangular. That was a joke. You are asleep. Please, get up. Okay? They had 3 non-square meals a day. They had multiple meals a day because the food was not that satisfying. So they had to eat frequently, and their jaw was very strong, and they had good teeth, and good bone density, and good musculature, and they had all 4 wisdom teeth without having to extract them. That's how things used to be. And what has changed that has led to so much inflammation in today's society? Processing, refining, fermenting, storage, cooking, additives, altered soil, sterility, meaning we clean everything so thoroughly we lose many of the good microbes that are so crucial for our beautiful microbiome, and we selection of traits, hybridization, and of course genetic engineering. And there are other types of processing that are affecting our health and especially our gut. All of you are exposed to genetically modified foods. If you eat soy that's not organic, once in a while, okay, once in a while I ate soy that's not organic. There you go, you had GMOs. You already caused direct damage to your microbiome, and it could be permanent damage. Very difficult to undo. So if you want to reduce the inflammation in your gut, you first have to change your diet to something closer to what nature intended. And that's what I do with all my patients. If they have positive M2PK, that becomes their opportunity, their turn of fortune. It's a lucky moment that they have colorectal cancer, because it is so easy to get rid of it. It's not a life and death situation if you catch it that early. Instead, you can turn your life around. What a great opportunity to become healthier. And suddenly your gut is less bloating, and you digest healthier, and you get absorbing better, the nutrients come in, so that your metabolism has a chance, right? By the way, you're not what you eat, and you're not what you absorb necessarily. You are what you metabolize. That's the most important thing. But in order for that to take place, you have to first digest and absorb. And all of that would improve, thereby improving your entire health. Your brain will function better. Your immune system will be stronger. Your nervous system will not be so poisoned and so inflamed. It's all interactive. There is no one specialization based on body part. It's all interactive. So that's one thing people need to do. And it's not as difficult as you might think to make those changes. And if you have a positive M2PK test, I promise you, you'll be motivated to make some changes that will reduce the inflammation in your gut and in your entire body. And people start feeling so much better within a few weeks, sometimes even 1 week, that they are convinced that that's the path they have to take, and they're willing to make changes for the long term, not just for the short term. Just as an example, when we cook foods, we create many inflammatory compounds, the most important of which is the AGEs. The advanced glycosylated end product are one of the most inflammatory substances in your body. Every time you eat a brown food with a membrane that is slightly harder around it, like a roasted or broiled or fried food with a crust, that's the word, with a crust, you are actually allowing AGEs in large amounts to enter your body. Those create general inflammation, but they are not the only source. There are other sources of AGEs in your body, like excessive amount of sugar in your blood could do that too. and inappropriate combinations of sugars with proteins, fats, and nucleic acids. You can actually damage every component of your cell with AGEs and lead to widespread inflammation and free radical damage, all the way to the nucleus and the mitochondria, changing your genetic material and affecting your energy production. All that from AGEs, which are glycotoxins, highly oxidant substances that most people today are exposed to. Raise your hand if you have not eaten any crust in the last month. Nobody, except for one person, because she is a good follower of everything I say. But I cannot raise my hand because I eat crust once in a while. I travel a lot and I cannot control all of the food that I eat. And there is sometimes crust in it, I admit. So we form a lot of toxins and a lot of inflammatory processes in the body. Histamine is a very important component of inflammation. A lot of people have the symptoms of allergies and they think that they have allergies. They do the test and they find that they don't have allergies because what they have instead is food sensitivities or adverse reactions to food. Then they do the test for that and they can't find anything there either. Or what they find might not be valid because of the lab test and the material that they use. Instead, it could just be something called histamine intolerance, which is more common than you think. Some studies are showing that more people today have histamine intolerance than ever we thought possible. It's basically a disequilibrium between the production of histamine in your gut versus the production of diamine oxidase, which is an enzyme supposed to break down histamine. If you don't make enough of DAO, diamine oxidase, you will accumulate more histamine. Today, I measure the histamine level in people's stool as a part of that FDH panel I mentioned earlier. It's the only test in America, to my knowledge, that actually measures histamine in your poop. And it tells us how much inflammation you have for that specific reason. It's easy to reverse. We can give people DAO as a supplement with the food that they eat. But there are specific foods that are very well known as the foods that either create histamine secretion in your gut or contain enough histamine to cause problem by themselves. What are the foods that are the worst offender? The fermented foods. The alcoholic beverages, the aged cheese, the aged foods, pickled, and even food that have been, what do you call it? It's like sauerkraut, that have been fermented, but there's another word for that. Cultured, pickled, yes. You know what they are. So all of those foods are very rich in histamine and especially creating secretion of histamine. And they're highly addictive, partially because of that. All food that have been fermented, including kombucha, including sauerkraut, including yogurt, anything that has fermented is going to be causing histamine release. Some people can handle it, others can't. How would you know without testing? Some people have colorectal cancer because they have severe inflammation as a result of severe histaminosis, which we test for. For other people, histamine level was low, was normal, was even below normal. But they had extremely high secretory IgA, an antibody that's secreted by the mucous membrane that indicates a significant immune response. Some people have extremely high defensin, which is another molecule, which is made both by the skin and by the gut, showing the connection between the two tissues. The skin and the gut have some commonalities. If you have a lot of defensin in your gut, it means that you lost your immune power of the immune system and you are manufacturing your own natural antibiotics from your own gut because you are not able to handle the microbes that are in your system. whether it's candida or other types of fungus, and we test for different types of fungus, not just for candida. This is a way to find out what is inflaming you or you or you, and each person has a different constellation of factors that lead to inflammation. That's where the treatment varies. Some people have to avoid histamine foods and take DAO, whereas other people have to avoid the allergenic foods that are causing them to secrete more IgA. Some people have to control their microbes in their gut to reduce the defensin that is out of control. Some people have complete global loss of energy in the gut, and all the numbers are going to be extremely low because they cannot manufacture anything anymore. The inflammation has been there so long that basically the gut is almost dead, and it cannot digest, it cannot do healthy peristalsis. All of those things can show themselves in a stool test that looks for 30 parameters and that is open-ended. If they find something that was not in the list, they will still report it. Other microbes that I've never seen before suddenly appear because it was actually looked at and identified and given to me in the actual report. This is the kind of information that allows each person individually to treat the inflammatory source of the cancer and A, improve digestion and health because of the absorption, and B, eliminate the reason for the cancer to even exist. And lucky for you, two things exist in the gut. One, the fact that the gut is sloughing off rapidly. Within 8-9 days, most of the cells have sloughed off, and you have new cells coming. So if you have early form of cancer, it will slough off with the cells. There will be no reason for it to keep coming. And that's why 3 months is enough for most people who have positive M2PK to reverse their colorectal cancer. Such great news about that fearful cancer. The second thing that's important is, according to scientific studies, cancer does not hold onto itself with the same powerful glue that other cells hold themselves to. That glue that holds cells together, that creates membranes, that creates impermeable lines of cells, that glue is very, very important for functionality of our organ. Cancer does not have that glue, or has so little of it that is frail. And that's why as soon as you know how to target it, as soon as the inflammation goes down, the cancer sloughs off more easily than regular tissue. And that's good news. Those two allow us to reverse colorectal cancer with great success. Speaking of those cells and the glue between them, we have a test called zonulin. Zonulin is another parameter that we test for within that FDH panel. And it tells you about your permeability, your gut permeability. Because if zonulin goes up, that's an indication that the glue has been lost in your gut. And now you are allowing large molecules to enter and start an immune reaction, inflammation, both in the gut and in the system. Plus, it prevents you from digesting and absorbing the nutrients that you actually require for health. Zonulin is associated always with autoimmune disease. Anybody who suspects autoimmunity, whether it's eczema that you have, or rheumatoid arthritis, or other types of chronic aches, pains, inflammation, has to rule out autoimmune disease. Anybody with problem with the thyroid and so on. There are at least 80 types of autoimmune disease that have names, and thousands that don't have names. If zonulin goes up, you have autoimmune disease. And you don't need to even know what the name of it is. And then you just need to treat the gut. Lower the zonulin. Reduce the inflammation and the causes for it. And as the zonulin goes down, your leaky gut is repaired. And when the leaky gut is repaired, the autoimmune disease is usually going into remission. Another reason to do this test. You see how health of your entire body connects with the health of your gut and connects also with the risk of developing colorectal cancer, which now you can easily reverse if you catch it early. And if it's very high, you have to be compliant for additional months. But after 3 months, everybody will have a much lower number. After 6 months, further improvement. It has to continuously improve, or else I would consider doing other tests like the oncoblood test or other tests that would be appropriate so that we're not risking people's health or life unnecessarily. So far, in almost 14 years, we have reached such a great success of 100% reversal that I can honestly say that having colorectal cancer caught by the M2PK is not any more scary than catching a cold or sneezing. You know it's going to be reversed based on our accumulative statistics of the last 13 or 14 years. And you don't have to be afraid of it anymore. If you have family history, if you are old, and I mean over 50 or 60, and I'm sorry, I'm old by that as well, that increases your risk. The population of people who are above 60 had already 17% of them positive for M2PK, as opposed to 10% in the general population. So if you have that, if you have chronic digestive symptoms, you already have suffered from inflammation for long enough. Test to see if you have colorectal cancer. This test will be the first one to catch anything. It could be 500,000 cells, it could be a few 100,000 cells of cancer, and the oncoblood requires 2 million cells to be caught, which is much more. But the oncoblood will be a confirmation of something that could already be clinical enough to justify other measures. So for everything, you need clinical judgment. And what we are doing is we are training physicians and other health professionals who are qualified, who have a background of some anatomy, physiology, not for everyone, but for people who have education that will justify giving them the responsibility of helping other people. These people can be certified as colorectal cancer experts using these tests and helping people reverse colorectal cancer using the protocol that have been proven effective for over a decade. So I invite anybody who is a practitioner, naturopath, chiropractor, MD, DO, DDS, dentist, and other people with sufficient credentials, at least a Bachelor of Science or its equivalent. At least a Bachelor of Science or its equivalent with background in some clinical experience or clinical care. Those people would be qualified to take the entire online certification course that would make them colorectal cancer specialists, allowing them to do what it takes to convince their patients to improve their lifestyle and to take the appropriate supplements, change their exposure environmentally, do the appropriate ancillary test to get to a negative M2PK test and therefore to get rid of colorectal cancer and say goodbye to it forever. Thank you very much. Question time?
Yeah, I have to be a little bit quick.
I can always reschedule.
Hold on.
Dr. T, what's been interesting is that I do as you know, I've done the doctor's data stool test for many years, and all of my clients who wear their cell phone close to their body have a lysozyme inflammation level of close to like 800, when under 600 is normal. So I've seen all these clients, because I do a stool test for every one of my clients, and I'm being trained by Dr. T, and I found that every person has a cell phone close to their body for whatever time had significant increases in the lysozyme, in the inflammation, just in the last year. It's amazing. Up to 1,200 young people who have the cell phone on all the time.
Right. All electromagnetic sources of exposure should be dramatically reduced.
More questions?
Hi. Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about like the fungi, opportunistic fungi infections following particular perturbations like antibiotics, and how that affects inflammation and the gut bacteria.
Right. There are several reasons why people today are so inflamed, and one of them is exposure to medical drugs. Antacids, antidepressants, antibiotics especially are notorious, but it could be even some simple things like birth control pill that most people are exposed to. And obviously you're disturbing the healthy microbiome, and it's in addition to the fluoridation of the water and chlorine and GMOs and hybridized food. There are so many reasons why today we have an unhealthy microbiome, which leads to changes in the entire immune system response and inflammation. That imbalance could lead to opportunistic infections such as microbial fungus, and there are many types of fungus as well. The treatment usually involves the appropriate forms of probiotics, prebiotics, change of diet, reduced overall inflammation, improved gut integrity, and you can target those microbes with molecules that are proven effective that are not going to cause additional detrimental effect. So instead of using antibiotics for fungus, I would use things like terpineol for all, which is on your slide. All the bioactive plant fraction molecules that are available in liquid formulas have been scientifically validated to reverse cancer, inflammation, microbial overload, fungus or bacteria or virus. And that's why the bioactive plant fraction molecules and their formulas are a part of my protocol for reversing colorectal cancer. I always give them to people with positive M2PK. Now, legally, maybe it's hard for me to say I'm reversing colorectal cancer. Somebody might shoot me for that. So I will say I'm eliminating colorectal risk, colorectal cancer risk. Then maybe it's less inflammatory of a statement. Okay, there are other things that could be used, like berberine type products and others, but these are extremely powerful, and they've been validated individually as molecules. And in these formulas, all you have is those molecules. So they are actually proven to be far, far more effective than the essential oil that they derived from. You see this test here about the inflammation and terpineol for all. And there were another one that showed that it is much more effective in causing apoptosis than the original tea tree oil from which it's derived. So you can do tea tree oil, but if you take just the active molecules out of it, the terpene and all, it's far, far more effective. And that's what you get as a part of the bioactive plant fraction formulas. That's a part of the treatment, but it's not the whole treatment. You have to treat each person's individual sources of inflammation. You have to know what your histamine level is. Unfortunately, labs like Dr. Data, they don't test for those, for zonulin and histamine and so forth in the panel, so you still really want to do this test if you want to know.
Do you
Yes.
give nystatin for any of those fungal infections? Because I have lichen planus of the mouth, and I went to a specialist. She did give me a bunch of stuff in it.
Right.
You have it compounded, this mouthwash, and nystatin was in it. Does that knock out too much stuff in your gut?
Well, it's still a toxic drug, and I would prefer to start with things that are non-toxic. Even food-grade hydrogen peroxide can kill fungus in the mouth. You know, why go the drug option when you can do things that are no less effective, that are available to everyone, and that are turning into water and oxygen, like hydrogen peroxide? Try that instead. Or the bioactive plant fraction, sometimes I just put straight in my mouth and let them do their job in my mouth before swallowing them.
It killed the pain, though.
It also is anti-inflammatory and kills the
killed
pain.
Yeah.
No, it also kills pain, reduces pain and inflammation. That's what they do. Yes?
Hold on.
I've seen a lot of reports lately about the use of cannabis for treating inflammation in certain types of cancers. I'm wondering if you have any comment on that.
I've read some of the research about it. A lot of it is still preliminary, and there's so much real research intertwined with folklore that it's sometimes hard to differentiate everything. I still prefer to use things that are validated over more years. And from what I've seen so far, people who benefit often benefit from reduction of symptoms. I'd like to treat more of the cause than mitigate symptoms. Although I respect mitigation of symptoms as a valuable thing, instead of using morphine or other toxic drugs that can be lethal by themselves, but I cannot say that I would immediately recommend that for everyone because I don't know what cause of the inflammation I'm providing to the patient. Let's treat the cause for the inflammation, not just treat the inflammation with an anti-inflammatory approach.
Okay, we're going to take a break.